While doing research for the most recent Temporal Times commentary, that being the one I did with Mushroom Girl on Sav, I watched a video by GoatCatto on the topic of Mushroom Girl, and holy shit, it's bad. How bad is it, I hear some of you ask? Well, to give you an idea of just what kind of arguments this video has, this is one of the points the video opens with.
Based on what Mushroom Girl has told us, she does not think she needs to listen to trans or black voices about subjects that she is clearly uneducated on, which, in my opinion, is just fucking gross. Her excuse for this belief is that hundreds of minorities speaking up about their concerns isn't enough to prove their point. As according to Mushroom, there needs to be quote-unquote evidence to back their claims up. I'm sorry, Mushroom Girl, but that is not how it works. If there are hundreds of trans voices, black voices, any other voices in general telling you that you're in the wrong and spreading harmful and even hateful information, then that means you're very obviously, doing something wrong and you need to listen instead of spreading false information.
You know, when I heard this, I couldn't help but think of a Vox article I read several years back with the headline, "Abortion is Black Genocide Inside the Black Anti-Abortion Movement." Now, it should be noted that up until recently, Black Americans were less likely to support abortion rights than white Americans for a number of very complicated reasons I'm not getting into. Black people in general are also just more likely to be socially conservative than white people, regarding a number of issues, including LGBT rights, by the way. During the 2004 presidential election, Republican incumbent President George W. Bush even had his campaign do things like hire people to make robocalls in black areas of the country, saying that John Kerry supported same-sex marriage, or having people pose as gay activists from San Francisco outside of black majority polling places, specifically in hopes of making Kerry look less appealing to black voters. Some have even taken a conspiratorial view towards LGBT rights, as Just a Robot talked about in his video on No One Asked.
There's a ton of anti-LGBT stuff in the black community that we almost never talk about. I've even met a few black guys who believe that the LGBT community is white nationalism. I guess I'm just a little bothered about this because I recently discovered my personal trainer is a black Israelite, and we got into an argument about who had more rights, gay people or black people.
Yeah, and he was the one who started that argument. The dude is an absolute nutcase. He believes in like every conspiracy. He unironically said Hitler was a good guy who was on the side of the black man because he was killing the white Jews for stealing the black religion.
Hi, just wanted to butt in here and say that although I've never heard that personally, I have heard a surprising amount of black people have positive things to say about Adolf Hitler. One example that comes to mind is Louis Farrakhan, the former head of the Nation of Islam and the man who allegedly killed Malcolm X. When he was being attacked in the 80s for being Black Hitler, he responded by saying the following. "So I said to members of the press, why won't you go and look into what we are saying about the threats on Reverend Jackson's life? Here the Jews don't like Farrakhan, and so they call me Hitler. Well, that's a good name. Hitler was a very great man. He wasn't great for me as a black man, but he was a great German, and he rose Germany up from the ashes of her defeat by the united forces of all of Europe and America after the First World War. Yet Hitler took Germany from the ashes and rose her up and made her the greatest fighting machine of the 20th century, brothers and sisters. And even though Europe and America had deciphered the code that Hitler was using to speak to his chiefs of staff, they still had trouble defeating Hitler, even after knowing his plans in advance. Now, I'm not proud of Hitler's evil towards Jewish people, but that's a matter of record. He rose Germany up from nothing. Well, in a sense, you could say there is a similarity in that we are rising our people up from nothing. But don't compare me with your wicked killers." Farrakhan's organization, or the organization he used to run, I should say, the Nation of Islam, is also responsible for the 3-volume work, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, which alleges that the Jewish population was responsible for things like the transatlantic slave trade, the notion of racial inferiority, and the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. It's utterly nonsensical pseudo-history. And then, of course, there's Kanye West.
I've done a lot of study. I think Hitler was a really bad guy, and I repudiate what Hitler did. I understand that the British intelligence set him up and used him.
I like Hitler.
I don't like Hitler. And I know you're trying to be shocking with that.
I'm not trying to be shocking. I like Hitler. I see good things about Hitler also. You can't say out loud that this person ever did anything good, and I'm done with that. I'm done with the classifications. Every human being has something of value that they brought to the table, especially Hitler. Yeah, I don't like the word evil next to Nazis. I think we need to look at...
Oh, my goodness. Just because you don't like one group doesn't mean the other. But look,
I love Jewish people, but I also love Nazis. Well, I want to say there's a lot of good Nazis that were just fighting for their country. And for them all...
Like George Soros.
For them all to get put in a box. They're all in a box. Every Nazi's bad. Well, could some of the Nazis have just been fighting for their country? They're all... we can't put them all in a box.
All right. Do you have any comments on Hitler?
I have to agree with you.
Schwarzenegger said he loved Hitler. They gave him an award. I'm just saying, I don't like Nazis, and I don't like what some of the mafias are doing either.
I like Hitler.
I brought up Obama, the first black president, and asked him to name the first gay president. He said Obama. Why? Because according to him, Michelle Obama used to be a man, and their kids were adopted from Kenya. I'm not making this shit up. This is really what he believed.
However, what is important to note is that many of these anti-abortion black people have attempted to tie in the treatment they've gone through as black Americans with their dislike of abortion. The famous black civil rights leader, Jesse Jackson, for example, compared abortion rights to slavery in a 1977 article for Right to Life News, which he has since retracted and said he no longer stands by, for the record. There are those who argue that the right to privacy is of higher order than the right to life. I do not share that view. I believe life is not private, but rather it is a public and universal. If one accepts the position that life is private, and therefore you have the right to do with it as you please, one must also accept the conclusion of that logic. That was the premise of slavery. You could not protest the existence or treatment of slaves on the plantation because that was private and therefore outside of your right to concern. A similar comparison was made by Dr. Ben Carson in 2015.
What if somebody has an unwanted pregnancy? Should they have the right to terminate it? No. Think about this. During slavery, and I know that's one of those words you're not supposed to say, but I'm saying it. During slavery, a lot of the slave owners thought that they had the right to do whatever they wanted to that slave, anything that they chose to do. And, what if the abolitionist had said, I don't believe in slavery. I think it's wrong. But you guys do whatever you want to do. Where would we be?
Jackson goes on to discuss abortion through the lens of the various injustices American society has created, including those that he as a black man has had to deal with or that his ancestors had to deal with. Another area that concerns me greatly, namely because I know how it has been used with regards to race, is the psycholinguistics involved in this whole issue of abortion. If something can be dehumanized through the rhetoric used to describe it, then the major battle has been won. So when American soldiers can drop bombs on Vietnam and melt the faces and hands of children into a hunk of rolling protoplasm, and in their minds say they have not maimed or killed a fellow human being, something terribly wrong and sick has gone on in that mind. This is why the Constitution called us 3/5 human, and then whites further dehumanized us by calling us, I'm not saying that word. It was part of the dehumanizing process. The first step was to distort the image of us as human beings in order to justify that which they wanted to do and not even feel like they had done anything wrong. Those advocates of taking life prior to birth do not call it killing or murder, they call it abortion. They further never talk about aborting a baby because that would imply something human. Rather, they talk about aborting the fetus. Fetus sounds less than human and therefore can be justified. Again, Jackson has changed his mind on this topic. However, many of the tools we saw here are still present among black anti-abortion activists today. Which brings us back to Vox. The article documents, well, the black anti-abortion movement, more specifically how it uses a combination of socially progressive language and real issues black people have had to face in American history to push a conservative and socially regressive agenda. While anti-abortion activists have attempted to link abortion to racism for decades, the argument that abortion poses a unique threat to black lives has seen an increase in attention in recent years, the result of a collaboration between the conservative black church, black anti-abortion activists, and some white anti-abortion organizations. These claims speak to real fears about racism in the medical system, calling back to the unethical harm of the Tuskegee study and the days when women of color were forcibly sterilized by state eugenics programs. Actually, it's pretty coincidental that Tuskegee was mentioned because that and an entire history of medical mistreatment and just good old-fashioned medical misunderstandings about black people have led them to be much more distrustful of medicine than any other race. And this distrust includes skepticism of vaccines. This especially became notable during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially given that was happening at the same time as the resurgence in Black Lives Matter in response to the death of George Floyd. To quote an article from The Conversation on this very topic, "For some people, this will have triggered alarm bells and brought up the many historical examples of black people being used for experimental or unethical medical treatment. The debate took place during the international reckoning over racial inequalities sparked by the killing of George Floyd, so people likely felt empowered to ask questions about the testing and safety of the vaccine. And many more will have learned about the historical context which heightened the suspicion. People may have also begun to reflect on their own medical treatment and that of their families. It's well established that black people tend to experience much poorer medical outcomes than the rest of the UK population for conditions such as heart and kidney disease, blood pressure, diabetes, certain cancers, and death during pregnancy. Black people have also historically been underprescribed pain medication and are more likely to be institutionalized for their mental health problems. All these factors may have meant that in 2020, many black people could not just say yes when asked if they would take a new unlicensed vaccine without asking questions. As a black person, to do so at this time would be to show your ignorance of what has been established as historical and current systemic medical racism." So GoatCatto, what's your stance on vaccines out of curiosity? I'm personally very much in favor of them. Back to the Vox article. It's an apt comparison in the eyes of black anti-abortion activists, many of whom argue that Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger was a supporter of eugenics who, some say, worked to intentionally lower the black birth rate. Sanger's history isn't as clear-cut. She certainly did support a form of eugenics, but her work on birth control in the black community was not viewed with alarm by prominent African-American community leaders. I should also add, for those who are less familiar with the history of the pro-choice movement and the progressive era, that this claim is absolutely fucking stupid. Sanger believing that abortion was good for reducing the black population just doesn't make any fucking sense because, well, for one, Sanger didn't actually support abortion. In fact, she wrote in her 1922 book, Women and the New Race, "It is apparent that nothing short of contraceptives can put an end to the horrors of abortion and infanticide." The same book also saw her writing, "While there are cases where even the law recognizes an abortion as justifiable if recommended by a physician, I assert that the hundreds of thousands of abortions performed in America each year are a disgrace to civilization." Sanger also just didn't have an interest in race-based eugenics and even worked with black civil rights leader W.E.B. Du Bois to promote birth control in black communities. She believed that what she was doing would benefit everybody of all races equally, even writing in the magazine Negro Digest, which changed its name to Black World later on, for what must be incredibly obvious reasons. In 1946, the Negro race has reached a place in its history when every possible effort should be made to have every Negro child count as a valuable contribution to the future of America. Negro parents, like all parents, must create the next generation from strength, not from weakness, from health, not from despair. Clarence Thomas repeated this notion in one of his Supreme Court opinions, by the way. While discussing the constitutionality of an Indiana law which prevented abortion on the basis of race, sex, or disability, Thomas wrote, "This case highlights the fact that abortion is an act rife with potential for eugenic manipulation. From the beginning, birth control and abortion were promoted as means effectuating eugenics. Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger was particularly open about the fact that birth control could be used for eugenic purposes. These arguments about the eugenic potential for birth control apply with even greater force to abortion, which can be used to target specific children with unwanted characteristics. Even after World War II, future Planned Parenthood president Alan Guttmacher and other abortion advocates endorsed abortion for eugenic reasons and promoted it as a means of controlling the population and improving its quality. As explained below, a growing body of evidence suggests that eugenic goals are already being realized through abortion." Thomas even takes time to point out there are other black people who agree with his utter misunderstanding of history, writing, "Avoiding the word eugenics did not assuage everyone's fears. Some black groups saw family planning as a euphemism for race genocide, and believed that black people were taking the brunt of the planning under Planned Parenthood's ghetto approach to distributing its services. The Pittsburgh branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, for example, criticized family planners as bent on trying to keep the Negro birth rates as low as possible." Slightly later, Thomas talks about racial abortion rates and basically implies that any disparities are intentional. 8 decades after Sanger's Negro Project, abortion in the United States is also marked by a considerable racial disparity. The reported nationwide abortion ratio, the number of abortions per 1,000 live births, among black women is nearly 3.5 times the ratio of white women. And there are areas of New York City in which black children are more likely to be aborted than they are to be born alive, and are up to 8 times more likely to be aborted than white children in the same area. Whatever the reason for these disparities, they suggest that, insofar as abortion is viewed as a method of family planning, black people do indeed take the brunt of the planning. Abortion rights aren't even the only issue where Thomas has used racial politics to push a right-wing agenda. To quote from Corey Robbins' 2019 book, The Enigma of Clarence Thomas, take campaign finance. In the controversial 2010 case Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, the court's conservative majority, including Thomas, held that the First Amendment stops the government from restricting corporate spending on election-related activities, such as corporations airing their own political ads in support of a candidate or campaign. In his dissent, the liberal Justice John Paul Stevens denounced the court for overturning a century-long tradition of regulating corporate spending. The fountainhead of that tradition, wrote Stevens, is the Tillman Act of 1907, which bans any direct contributions from corporations to federal candidates. Stevens returned repeatedly to that legislation, citing it as a touchstone of good governance, a testament to Congress's recognition of the, quote, recurrent need to regulate corporate participation in candidate elections. For Thomas, the Tillman Act, named after longtime South Carolina Senator Benjamin Tillman, evoked something else entirely. 5 months after the court decided Citizens United, Thomas wrote a blistering opinion in an unrelated gun rights case that hinged, in part, on a Reconstruction-era interpretation of the Second Amendment. Rehearsing at length the murderous consequences for African Americans who were denied guns under Jim Crow, Thomas made a point of calling out a particular figure in this reign of racial terror. Take, for example, the Hamburg Massacre of 1876. There, a white citizen militia sought out and murdered a troop of black militiamen for no other reason than that they had dared to conduct a celebratory 4th of July parade through their mostly black town. The white militia commander, Pitchfork Ben Tillman, later described this massacre with pride. The leading white men of Edgefield had decided to seize the first opportunity that the Negroes might offer them to provoke a riot and teach the Negroes a lesson by having the white demonstrate their superiority by killing as many of them as was justifiable. None of the perpetrators of the Hamburg murders was ever brought to justice. Organized terrorism like that perpetuated by Tillman and his cohorts proliferated in the absence of federal enforcement of constitutional rights. With a nod to Stevens' dissent in Citizens United, Thomas dryly noted, quote, Tillman's contributions to campaign finance law have been discussed in our recent cases on that subject. In a speech at a law school in Florida that same term, Thomas was less circumspect. Defending the majority opinion in Citizens United, he drew a direct line between Stevens' favorite campaign finance reformer and white supremacy. Quote, go back and read why Tillman introduced that legislation, he told the audience. Tillman was from South Carolina. And as I hear the story, he was concerned that the corporations, Republican corporations, were favorable to blacks, and he felt that there was a need to regulate them. For Thomas, even the seemingly non-racial subject of campaign finance is, like so many other constitutional questions, deeply enmeshed in race. By the way, I looked into this, and I could find evidence the main inspiration of the Tillman Act was fears that corporations were giving large sums of money to Republicans. During the 1904 presidential election, Democrat Alton B. Parker alleged that corporations gave incumbent Republican President Theodore Roosevelt large sums of money in exchange for influence on administration policies. Although Roosevelt denied the charges, investigation held after the election found that corporations did make huge contributions to the Republican campaign. In response, Roosevelt called on Congress to enact campaign finance reform in 1905, and the spotlight shifted to a bill introduced 5 years earlier by Republican Senator William E. Chandler of New Hampshire. However, I could find no evidence to back up Thomas's claim that this was specifically because Democrats were worried Republican corporations were being too friendly to black people. I could go through various other examples of Thomas doing this. However, doing that would essentially require me reading out the entire chapter as well as just large chunks of the book more generally, so I won't bother. I do want to bring up one more example though, and that's Clarence Thomas defending racist actions in one case by warning that if the court stopped it, things could be made worse for minorities down the line. In its crudest form, racism is found in the negative attitudes and prejudices of whites, upon which they are willing to act, sometimes to devastating effects. In Georgia v. McCollum, the court ruled that criminal defendants, in this case 3 whites accused of assaulting 2 African Americans, should not be allowed to strike down potential jurors based on their race. Allowing defendants to make racially based preemptory challenges would violate the Equal Protection Clause, denying black citizens the right to serve on juries merely because they are black. The court already had held that prosecutors, as agents of the state, could not use peremptory challenges to reject potential jurors on the basis of their race. Georgia v. McCollum now applied that same rule to the defense. Even though criminal defendants are not state actors, the court reasoned that defendants are relying on a privilege or power of the state, the peremptory challenge in a state institution, the jury trial. Because their case and tools are authorized by the state, defendants are required to obey the Constitution's guarantee of equal protection, which binds the state and state actors. We hold the Constitution prohibits a criminal defendant from engaging in purposeful discrimination on the grounds of race in the exercise of preemptory challenges, wrote the liberal Justice Harry Blackmun for the court. All 4 of the court's conservatives, Thomas Scalia, William Rehnquist, and Sandra Day O'Connor, dissented or wrote concurrences that demurred from part of the the majority's opinion. The main, if not sole, objection of the 3 white conservatives was to the majority's claim that the criminal defendants should be thought of as state actors. Scalia called that position sheer insanity. Being tried for a crime, defendants are acted upon by the state, they do not act for the state. Thomas scarcely touched that issue, his concern shared by no other justice, liberal or conservative, save for a brief mention by O'Connor at the very end of her opinion, lay not with the actual defendants in the case, but with a hypothetical black defendant. Facing the prospect of a majority white or all-white jury, such a defendant might find himself wishing to use peremptory challenge to strike down potential white jurors and thereby secure a more racially balanced jury. I am certain, Thomas warns, that black criminal defendants will rue the day this court ventured down the road that inexorably will lead to the elimination of peremptory strikes. Flipping the racial script of the court's judgment, Thomas used race to undo the liberal jurisprudence of race. Instead of staying with the fact that the defendants were white, Thomas made them black. Instead of seeing the subject of rights as a prospective black juror, he focused on the rights of a black defendant. Having constructed the racial hypothetical in this way, Thomas evoked the 1880 case Strotter v. West Virginia, which struck down state prohibitions on blacks serving on juries. In Strotter, wrote Thomas, we reasonably summarized, without direct evidence in any particular case, that all white juries might judge black defendants unfairly. The liberal majority in McCollum held that to strike a potential juror, there had to be direct evidence that he harbors racial prejudice and is incapable of confronting and suppressing his racism. In Blackmun's words, this court firmly has rejected the view that assumptions of partiality based on race provide a legitimate basis for disqualifying a person as an impartial juror. Thomas countered that even when there is no evidence of such racism, it is fair to assume that the racial composition of a jury may affect the outcome of a criminal case. The fact that whites are racist and will act on that racism when in a group must be acknowledged. Despite a century's agitation for racial equality, concludes Thomas, I do not think that the basic premise of Strotter has become obsolete. So persistent is the significance of race. So, just to review, according to Clarence Thomas, examples of racism include abortion rights, campaign finance laws, gun control, and saying that white defendants on trial for assaulting black people shouldn't be allowed to just remove black people from their jury. That's not even getting into various other black people who have said things on race that, well, I'd hope you disagree with, given that you keep trying to play more progressive than thou with Mushroom Girl. Other names that come to mind are Larry Elder.
Wait, when you mentioned that the UK was ahead of us, they were. Do you know that the slave owners were compensated? After they lost their quote-unquote property, the government compensated slave owners.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so when people talk about reparations, do they really want to have that conversation? Because, like it or not, slavery was legal. And so their property, their legal property, was taken away from them after the Civil War. So you could make an argument that the people that are owed reparations, and not only just black people, but also the people whose, quote, property, close quote, was taken away after the end of the Civil War.
You tweeted at one stage, would I like Rachel Jeantel to fly my plane? Why would you say that?
I'll tell you why I said that, Pierce. I'll tell you why I said that. Because after you interviewed her, you condescendingly went on television the next morning and called her one smart cookie. Bull. Why don't you hire her as a nanny? Let's see how smart she is. It's a condescending kind of thing that a lot of white people say to black people. I think you're stupid for saying that kind of thing to try to get black people.
That wasn't my question.
That race and racism.
Do you think Rachel Jeantel is
when it doesn't?
Do you think she's stupid, Larry?
Racism is not a major problem in America anymore, Pierce. Racism is not a major problem in America anymore. The number one problem facing black people are the large number of black people born outside of wedlock.
Let me just get back to the question I asked you and see if you can actually answer the question. Do you think that Rachel Jeantel is stupid?
I think that I would rather have a George Zimmerman living in my neighborhood, and maybe if George Zimmerman were living in my neighborhood, we'd have fewer Oreo Castros. I thought we wanted people to be proactive. I thought we wanted people to say something. I know, I'm answering something different that ought to be answered.
Could you just answer my question?
George Zimmerman like he's some sort of criminal. He's not a criminal. He's a guy who cares about his neighborhood.
Shot dead an unarmed
He's a guy who cares
teenager.
about his neighborhood. He's a neighborhood watch guy. Don't you want people who are proactive? And there was crime in that neighborhood, Piers. I live in South Central.
There wasn't crime from Trayvon Martin in that neighborhood.
The burglar bars are not on there because of George Zimmerman. They're on there because of the minority of thug in the community that's messing up everybody's image and reputation. This is why people profile. Instead of being angry at George Zimmerman, be angry at the minority of the thug who's committing these kinds of crime.
Jesse Lee Peterson.
It was wrong during the so-called civil rights movement when they forced private white businesses like cafes and restaurants and things like that, when they allowed black people to do sit-ins on private white businesses, those folks who did not want black people in there, those people had the right to that because they decided that they were going to get up, they were going to go out and start a business. They were going to use their own money, their own time, their own hard labor, their work, and they decided, I'm going to start a business and I only want white people in there. They had a right to that, and it was wrong to let blacks do sit-in on private businesses. I didn't think that that was the right thing, and I grew up in Alabama. I grew up under the Jim Crow laws. I still thought that that was wrong. You can't take away someone else's freedom like that just to make someone else feel good.
You ready for this? It's a doozy.
I'm ready.
It's 2018 in America. Does racism exist?
Absolutely not. And it has never existed.
Whoa!
It has never.
Whoa!
It's a made-up word.
What about the picture in the 60s with the German Shepherds on the black guy, the civil rights movement, and the cops, and the guy like that?
Well, that's because you were having protests. Whenever you could have a protest today, and if people go out of control, you're going to see the same thing. It was just a protest. And you're hearing this from a man. I grew up in Alabama. I grew up under the Jim Crow laws. I went to an all-black school. There were signs that says for colors only, for whites only.
That sounds pretty racist.
Yeah. But it wasn't racist. It was a law that was brought about by the Democrats. And they brought that law into effect, and it separated people by law. But yet, most blacks and whites got along. They knew that all white people were not against black people. It was a law, and people just obeyed the law at the time. And when I was growing up, I had to pick cotton. The guys were taking out...
You were born on a plantation.
Have you ever picked cotton?
No, sir.
You have not lived until you pick cotton.
You're being too controversial for me. You're going to get my show taken off the air. It's fun to pick cotton.
It's fun. It makes a man out of you.
Really?
You know, I said once on my radio show that because most blacks are so lazy now, because of the government taking care of them, and then a lot of them are born with single mothers only in the homes, and the mothers don't make them work. And I said, I'm going to go to Alabama, buy some land, create a plantation, and I'm going to take the blacks back down there to show them how to work and be independent and earn their way. And all hell broke loose when I said that. Oh, he's for slavery, he's for that. But I knew what I meant by that.
Jesse Lee Peterson, black pastor and radio show host, ended up giving one of the most racist speeches of the evening, talking about how whites built the country and that blacks are destroying what whites have created. For example, Peterson stated, "I may not know your country, but I know black people, and their hearts are filled with evil." Peterson also said white people are the most attacked people on this side of heaven today. They accuse white people of everything. He added, white people built America with the help of God. If black people are smart enough to build a country, why don't they build Africa? Part of his speech was focused on his belief in the creation of a White History Month, which he believes should take place in July since, if it wasn't for white history, there wouldn't be no America. Nelson Mandela was an evil man, and when they brought him here to our country presenting him as a good person, I was saying, no, Nelson Mandela is the head of the African National Congress. He's not a good man. Do you agree with me that Nelson Mandela was an evil man? Peterson asked. Later in the interview, Peterson said, it seems to me people were better under apartheid than they are with what's happening now.
Say a hurricane is about to destroy the city you live in. 2 questions. What would you do? What would you do if you were black? Sadly, the 2 questions don't have the same answer. And then he goes on to say that the smart white folks of New Orleans left, and the dumb black folks stayed behind, and they had it coming. You think I'm exaggerating? He says, if black folks want to blame someone for this tragedy, they only need to look in the mirror. Okay? But wait. We're just warming up. Oh my God. He said, quote, when 75% of New Orleans residents had left the city, it was primarily immoral, welfare-pampered blacks that stayed behind and waited for the government to bail them out. He says, quote, about 5 years ago in a debate before the National Association of Black Journalists, I stated that if whites were to just leave the United States and let blacks run the country, they would turn America into a ghetto within 10 years. The audience, shall we say, disagreed with me strongly. Now I have to disagree with me. I gave blacks too much credit. It took a mere 3 days for blacks to turn the Superdome and the Convention Center into ghettos rampant with theft, rape, and murder. Quote, President Bush is not to blame for the rampant immorality of the blacks. Had New Orleans' black community taken action, most would have been out of harm's way. But most were too lazy, immoral, and trifling to do anything productive for themselves. All Americans must tell blacks this truth. It was blacks' moral poverty, not their material poverty, that cost them dearly in New Orleans.
This case was not about race at all. And what happened, you have the race hustlers and poverty pimps like Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, and others who turned it into a race issue in order to gain power and wealth. Using black Americans by dividing the races, intimidating white people in order to gather more power or get more power and wealth. George Zimmerman would have done whatever it took to protect himself. It didn't matter to George Zimmerman the color of the man. And this notion that Trayvon Martin was some little innocent kid tiptoeing to the tulips and George Zimmerman had nothing else to do but to go out and kill him is a lie. Trayvon Martin was a thug. His parents know that, you know that, I know that, or they knew that Trayvon Martin was a thug, and that's what it was all about.
Ben Carson.
Obamacare is really, I think, the worst thing that has happened in this nation since slavery.
Well, when you look at what the black community has been through, go all the way back to slavery. It was the family, the strong family units, and the faith in God that got people through that. They got people through Jim Crow, through severe segregation, through all the difficulties. But what really had a negative impact was when the government came along and said, there, you poor little thing. I'm going to take care of all your needs, and started implementing policies that were destructive to family formation. Those are the things that have hurt the black community the most.
Go through that museum on Ellis Island and look at the pictures of all those people who are hanging up there from every part of the world, many of them carrying all their earthly belongings in their 2 hands, not knowing what this country held for them. Look at the determination in their eyes. People who work not 5 days a week, but 6 or 7 days a week. Not 8 hours a day, but 10, 12, 16 hours a day. No such thing as a minimum wage. They work not for themselves, but for their sons and their daughters and their grandsons and their granddaughters, that they might have an opportunity in this land. That's what America is about. A land of dreams and opportunity. There were other immigrants who came here in the bottom of slave ships, worked even longer, even harder for less. But they too had a dream.
that one day their sons, daughters, grandsons, granddaughters, great-grandsons, great-granddaughters might pursue prosperity.
Ben Carson has chosen former federal judge Charles W. Pickering to serve as his Mississippi State chair, even though Pickering has a clear history of blatant racism. So Think Progress reports on this, quote, he opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and he attacked advocates who were working to end Jim Crow during the 1960s. They say Pickering left the Democratic Party in 1964 to protest the party's support for civil rights and renouncement of segregation, part of his history that he did not admit to during his Senate confirmation hearings. In the words of a public statement he signed in 1967, Pickering wanted to preserve our Southern way of life, of segregation, and he bitterly blamed civil rights workers for stirring up turmoil and racial hatred in the South.
Michael Massey.
But don't tell blacks that, because the majority are too blind, dumb, and ignorant to understand this. There was a time that blacks embraced being Americans and the virtues of same, but that mindset has ultimately taken a backseat to the shrill, insidious voices of those who preach the vitriolic heterodoxies of Marxism. I don't even know what that word means, heterodoxies. He says, in the final analysis, blacks are worse off today morally and spiritually than at any other time in the history of America. Whoa, any other time? Any other time. They're worse off today than any other time. So they're worse off than the times of segregation. They're worse off than the times of Jim Crow. They're worse off than the times of slavery. Suppose the Ku Klux Klan went on a murderous rampage, burning and destroying cities every time blacks murdered, raped, or viciously assaulted an innocent white person. Speaking of the KKK, I say it is time for blacks to be treated as the KKK have been.
Or how about the aforementioned Kanye West? You know, the gay fish.
Kanye West was opening for Nick Fuentes' show, America First. But it's more than the tech issues. It's also the fact that Nick Fuentes is a giant pile of garbage and openly says anti-Semitic, racist, and terrible things. And so perfect match for Kanye West to be there, I guess.
I wouldn't call it racism. It's a form of discrimination or bigotry. Racism is a dated concept. It's like a silly concept that people try to touch on to either to separate, to alienate, to pinpoint anything. It's stupid. It's like a bouncing ball in a room with two cats or something. When you don't feel like playing with a cat, let them literally fight over the bouncing ball. And the bouncing ball has nothing, no purpose, anything other than that it bounces. That's racism. It's not an actual thing that even means anything. You know, it's something that was used to hold people back in the past, but now there's been so many leaps and breaking of the rules that it's like played out like a style from the 1800s or something. You know, the real true freedom isn't in the words. The real true freedom is in the opportunity. And that's what I'm saying. It's opportunities and the dignity of people. Who's to say there could be a cab driver who's more dignified than a businessman? Who's to say that because this guy has an apartment at the top of the Louvre or something, he's more important than this guy staying down? Because it's a matter of how you are, how you treat human beings, and how you display that heart to people, how you talk to every person. And for us, the more power that you have, the less you are a king. The more you are a servant, the more power you have. We are servants. We're providing service with this interview. Maybe people will be, I don't want to assume what someone will get from this, but it's when I figured out what my position is when the doors opened up. It's literally like unlocking a code. And when I'm knocking at the door saying, I'm a god or something like that, it's like, okay, well, God, stay out there. But if I come in and, mind you, when someone's like, hey, I want to come up, I'd like to sweep up your floor for you, everyone's like, all right, cool. Come in. I need my floor swept. To position yourself as a servant, because that's all we are. We're servants to God. This is a Christian view of mine, you know. I think that's the best you can be. The lowest is the best you can be. The interviewer asked, they say you gave a 45-minute toast to yourself at the wedding. Kanye says, quote, and what I talked about in it was the idea of celebrity and celebrities being treated like blacks were in the 1960s, having no rights, and the fact that people can slander your name. I said that in the toast.
You hear about slavery for 400 years. For 400 years, that sounds like a choice. Like, you was there for 400 years and it's all of y'all? You know, like, it's like we're mentally in prison. I like the word prison because slavery goes too direct to the idea of blacks. It's like slavery, Holocaust Jews, slavery is blacks. So prison is something that unites us as one race, blacks and whites being one race. That we're the human.
Why did I show you all of those clips? Well, the answer is very simple. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the I have a black friend argument, which somebody lazily trods out whenever they're accused of racism. The problem with this argument is some minorities are fucking idiots who hold bigoted and yes, even racist positions. For that matter, no race is immune to stupidity, and saying that one person is more educated on a topic because of their race is, well, idiotic to say the very least. Okay, now that I got that out of the way, let's actually talk about GoatCatto's video on every other ground. Early on in the video, we get 2 slideshows of Mushroom Girl doing bad things. However, if you stop to read them, you quickly realize that a good chunk of them don't actually give you any understanding of what the fuck is going on in this situation MG was involved in when she said these things. Take this screenshot, for example. You notice something missing? This is supposed to be Mushroom Girl reacting badly, or strongly stating her opinion in response to 2 gay people telling her that her gay OCs come off as fetishy. Well, okay, who are these people? Why did they say that? What was their reasoning behind it? What OCs are we talking about? How did Mushroom Girl draw them? I'm not even unwilling to concede that Mushroom Girl's response here was kind of stupid. However, I still need more information before I can believe this is anything but somebody reacting somewhat hostilely to possibly totally nonsensical criticism. There are also just several pictures where I genuinely don't get what's so unreasonable about what Mushroom Girl is saying. Like here, where Mushroom Girl is telling people to watch the video in full before forming an opinion on what she has to say? Okay, what's inherently unreasonable about that? For that matter, what's unreasonable about saying that even though you have an OC named Arson, you aren't responsible for examples of arson in the real world? Rare as it is, there are people named Arson in the real world. Are they responsible for arson occurring in the real world? Of course not. That's fucking stupid. Also, if your point is that Mushroom Girl is bad for saying this, wouldn't it have made more sense to actually show her saying this and not just you saying she said this? Nitpicky, sure, but it still annoys me. That's not even getting into the parts where I genuinely think the other people GoatCatto shows in the screenshots are far more unreasonable than MG. Like this screenshot, which criticizes Mushroom Girl for criticizing antis for harassment, which is that not a valid criticism? I don't get what exactly GoatCatto is going for here. However, my eye is drawn to the person saying that if there are antis of a group, then it must just be a bad thing to support. Even ignoring how circular this argument is, that's just not always the case. Back in the early days of the brony community, there were a group called anti-bronies who were very sternly against, well, bronies. Does that mean that they were a gross thing to support? For that matter, since that entire group has mostly gone away, does that mean that it's no longer a gross thing to support? Like, how does this work exactly? Or this screenshot where somebody tries to argue against Mushroom Girl's position on bi lesbians by saying that she just shouldn't have an opinion on the topic. This is an argument that GoatCatto repeats, by the way, when talking about Mushroom Girl's stance on blackwashing.
Mushroom, sweetie, you and me, we're crackers. We can't tell people what bad black representation is. What the fuck is wrong with you?
However, both examples lead me to one very important question, which is, if Mushroom Girl should not have an opinion on these topics, why exactly do you keep arguing with her opinion on these topics in hopes of changing her mind? Or, to put it a little bit more simply, have you ever heard the phrase belief in belief by any chance? On the topic of the bi-lesbian conversation, and I know I pointed this out in my commentary on Sav on Temporal Times commentaries, but I figured I might as well also point it out here, this message is supposed to be a shining example of reasonable criticism towards Mushroom Girl, and yet if you actually read it, a good chunk of the arguments made come down to...
Some say, I've heard a couple people say...
Some say that it's a sour grapes book. Some people say...
However, there are a couple other things that are worth noting. For example, point number 4 gets on the Mushroom Girl for using the fact that she's bisexual as a shield against criticism from her position on bisexual lesbians, only to say in the exact same point that she is ignoring bisexuals in order to have this opinion. Funnily enough, GoatCatto also says that Mushroom Girl will only listen to these groups of people when they go along with her narrative.
It's like you don't think their voice matters unless it fits your agenda. It's just sickening.
Point 2 starts with the assumption that Crying Blossom's video on Mushroom Girl was good and works backwards in order to criticize her for being so rude in the face of legitimate criticism. However, if you're like me and consider Crying Blossom's video on Mushroom Girl to be terrible, as in the third worst commentary of 2022 terrible, you aren't exactly compelled by this line of thinking. Furthermore, I find this tone policing of Mushroom Girl to be incredibly hypocritical given its Crying Blossom and your side more generally that keeps giving off the incredibly destructive criticism of you aren't allowed in this conversation. Ever.
From your own mouth, you're bisexual. So why are you discussing this and deciding what is and isn't harmful to us lesbians? It's not your place to decide if it is or isn't. Mushroom Girl is not a lesbian. They are a bi individual. And so they should not be talking about lesbian issues when they have no idea what we face and what we feel. It's not their place to decide and dictate what we should feel about that. It's not their place to try and compare different concepts that have zero weight to each other.
And yes, GoatCatto does say that both they and Crying Blossom were just calmly trying to educate Mushroom Girl.
Now, before I made this video, I attempted to try and understand Mushroom Girl's perspective, and me and my friends tried to calmly educate her and get her to listen to us about why the things she was saying were harmful and misleading. However, we were brushed off, insulted, and invalidated, just like Crying Blossom was when Mushroom Girl responded to their video that respectfully tried to educate her more on the topic of how the label bisexual lesbians or bi-lesbians is harmful and misleading.
And by the way, GoatCatto never explains how Mushroom Girl invalidated them, insulted them, or brushed them off, and going through the screenshots, well, I can kind of grant them insulted, however, nowhere did Mushroom Girl make any attempt to invalidate them, and I wasn't aware you could brush somebody off while having a pretty damn lengthy conversation with them, to the point where they can put it in a montage in their video on you. Regarding blackwashing, it shouldn't surprise you to learn that GoatCatto's takes are equally as contradictory and nonsensical. Here they are criticizing Mushroom Girl for criticizing blackwashing and instead suggesting that people use alternate universe original characters for these works if they want representation in them. Even ignoring the fact that we just heard GoatCatto say that they, as a white person, do not have the right to say what is and isn't good representation, despite now saying that AUOCs would be bad representation, this point still doesn't make any sense because what we're talking about is blackwashing. GoatCatto is right that AUOCs don't get the same traction as the actual shows. However, neither do race-swapped characters, so I don't see what your point is here. Oh, there's also this part.
All that's in the fucking comments is, oh my god, Yas Queen, you're so progressive. They want that.
Since when was Yas AAVE? I thought that was primarily associated with White Valley girls. Anyway, starting at this point, GoatCatto begins playing Mushroom Girl's video on Poopy Butthole. That's a sentence I just said. And you can tell when they interject because they play a sound that, to be blunt, sums up this entire video pretty damn well.
To be making a little response on the extremely fucking bullshit that PB made. PB made a video on me where instead of actually addressing the shit I said, well, they addressed a little bit of it. Mostly what they were trying to do was poison the well and make me look like a terrible person based on shit that happened like a year ago that I have already apologized for.
For those curious, that interjection was on screen for 1 second and 2 frames. Maybe it's in hope that we don't notice just how absolutely terrible GoatCatto's writing is. Even ignoring the fact that the T in that's should be capitalized, there should be an apostrophe between the second T and the S, so that it actually means that is. GoatCatto then goes on to say that the issue is that Mushroom Girl has a history of defending racist people and has a history defending them. I assume the them is racist people, so they essentially just typed that Mushroom Girl has a history of defending racist people and a history of defending racist people. This point about Mushroom Girl defending racist people is repeated word for word in GoatCatto's next text overlay, by the way, along with her making a point that essentially comes down to,
"That's a nice argument. Unfortunately, you're white."
GoatCatto then goes on to give us, just watch.
Posted to Toy House on November 5th this year. Posted to Toy House on November 14th this year. Posted to Toy House on May 2nd this year. Also, to explain the screenshot of me admitting that what I was doing was romanticization, I made an entire video a while back on why romanticization is a very misused word in the art community and why romanticization by itself is not an inherently harmful thing.
I'm audio ducting over this clip so my audience knows that I'm not making it up, while also not having to be subjected to the absolutely terrible audio of this bit that goes on for 2 full minutes. The entire bit is the guy in the top right corner keeps looking up different things in Google Scholars about media affecting reality, only to become increasingly frustrated as he learns that articles on this topic exist. We don't actually see what any of these studies say or how they would debunk Mushroom Girl's point. We're just kind of told that they're out there, which on its own doesn't mean anything. My Google Scholar search for vaccines cause autism got 43,000 results. That does not inherently mean that vaccines cause autism. That would be fucking ridiculous. In fact, the first result Google Scholars gave me, that being a 2014 article with the headline, "Effective Message in Vaccine Promotion, a Randomized Trial," specifically notes the, quote, misperception that vaccines cause autism. As for the bit itself, well, you're watching it right now. It's literally just the triggered meme. Remember the one that was popular like 6 years ago now? Really happy you brought that back, GoatCatto. The bit doesn't even make any sense. I think the idea is that guy is getting really mad looking at all of the evidence that romanticization is harmful in media, but why does he keep looking up things specifically about why romanticization in media is harmful? Seriously, look at some of the things he searches. They include, but are not limited to, scholarly articles about how romanticization in media is harmful, and how romanticization in the media is harmful. Have I mentioned that this bit goes on for 2 minutes yet? Anyway, now it's time for some miscellaneous bullshit.
You think you know it all, so I'm going to treat you like you do.
You're treating her like she knows it all? So you are acting in this video as if she knows everything. That is an attitude that is totally contradicted by the rest of your video.
We're not trying to cancel you, we're just trying to hold you accountable for your actions. But also, by the way, we're going to see you as irredeemable for the rest of your life because you made a blackface joke when you were 14.
By the way, this blackface joke was not racist in the slightest. It was, like, edgy, but, like, it wasn't as bad as it sounds. When you hear a blackface joke, you definitely think of something very, very offensive in your head, but it was not as offensive as you're thinking. Basically, I wish I had the screenshot, but
It's okay, Mushroom. I have the screenshots right here. Also, I want to correct you on something. Making a blackface joke is not only offensive, it is racist. Blackface in and of itself is racist. You shouldn't be joking about that. I know you've acknowledged it now, but the fact that you think it's not as offensive as it seems, it's just, hello?
Okay, this I just don't get. Your evidence that MG's joke is racist is that it involved blackface, and blackface is racist. The problem with that is you can make jokes about racist concepts without the jokes in of themselves being racist. Take this joke from American Dad as an example.
Here we are. Time to celebrate our brothers from other mothers.
Dad, are you positive this is what the invitation said?
Yes, trust me. Whoops.
You made us look like complete racists back there. Did you even read the invitation?
Of course, I skimmed it for keywords, which were black and face.
It says black people changing the face of America.
The joke wasn't racist. Fuck, the joke wasn't even that Stan was racist. The joke was that he was an idiot. Point is, you can use racist concepts to tell non-racist jokes. Anyway, that's all I want to cover, so final thoughts? Wow, this video was terrible for reasons I've outlined for the past fucking hour. I did not expect this commentary to go on for as long as it did. Good night, and good luck.